joke that back in school I did some of my best sleeping in science class. And yet, today when I hear the scholars, when I hear the professors talk about the evolutionary process, that you and I are what we are today because we've developed and evolved from lower forms into human beings over millions and millions of years. Well, even though I'm no scientist, I simply marvel when I hear that. Because to believe that really takes a lot of faith, doesn't it? You see, we understand that not only is that contrary to God's word, but more than that, it wars against human reason, and it wars against common sense, because we look at ourselves and we study ourselves and examine ourselves, and we quickly realize we are fearful and wonderfully made. This is no accident. This is no product of chance, but this is something that has been divinely made. You see, we can take weeks and months and years to study what God has done here, this human frame, and we're never going to understand it all. The intricacies of the eye, or the ear, or the hand, something that no man has ever produced, no machine, no robot, nothing like it. And the internal organs, the heart and the lungs and the liver. And it wasn't that God used a cookie cutter on all of us, but every one of us can look at ourselves and say that God knit me together in my mother's womb to be unique. In that dark and secret place, the psalmist says, God carefully crafted me and you to be exactly what God wanted us to be. He knit us together in our mother's womb to be unique, each one of us, to have one-of-a-kind fingerprints and retina prints and DNA. And he determined the gender. He determined the ethnic makeup. And he formed each of us. He crafted each of us in such a way that each of us has our own gifts and talents and ability and our own special and unique personality. No cookie cutter, no mass production with God, but each one of us is a tribute to his divine ingenuity and his divine artistry, his divine workmanship, a miracle. Each one of us. And then one day, there came another miracle. The miracle of birth. And if you've ever been there, if you've ever been in the delivery room, you know it is a miracle. All of a sudden there's a slap and a cry and little lungs filled with air, and these tiny little fingers start to wiggle, and these tiny little eyes with tiny little eyelashes, they're slammed shut to the light. And then there's a mother, and she takes in her arms for the very first time this miracle that has been growing in her womb, and she does it because God has worked in her a miracle as well. A unique heart, a mother's heart that is going to care for this child and feed this child and nurture this child and sacrifice for this child, and if called upon, even die for that child. It's just one miracle after another. And sometimes we don't give it a lot of thought, do we? What God has done for us. So often we simply take it for granted. That God has given us the ability to simply get up in the morning and to fill our lungs with air, and then to reach with a hand for the toothbrush, and to read the newspaper with eyes, and to digest it all with incredible minds, and to use this wonderful thing that God has done for us throughout the entire day. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And then the fact that God has given each of us a mother to nurture and care for us, and from little on. So often we take that for granted too, don't we? And yet here's the greatest miracle of all. The miracle of us. The miracle of life and birth. The miracle of a mother's love. All of those are the product of the greatest miracle of all. The miracle of God's grace. Because you see, there isn't one of us who deserves it. Not one of us that should have any of these things. What King David said of himself back in the Old Testament is certainly true of every one of us. Surely I have been a sinner from birth, he said. In fact, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Now that wasn't God's doing. That wasn't God's doing at all. That you and I came into this world with a sinful nature. That was our doing. Sadly, we pass our sinfulness from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. That wasn't God's doing at all. And yet, each one of us comes in contact with the miracle of God's grace, the miracle of birth, the miracle of life, a time here in this world that is completely undeserved. And yet, out of his grace, God gives us this time nonetheless, because he has something incredible in mind for us. Let us pray.